Hi, Mike Valinsky with Taurus.ag. Just want to take a few minutes to talk about reproduction in plants and some of the things we maybe want to think about in terms of stress management with the dry conditions across most of Canada. Now, these are the input products that make a crop. The plant takes these inputs and using its genetic machinery makes all the molecules necessary to grow that crop. It also makes all the molecules necessary to deal with stress, to deal with photosynthesis, to build the cells and provide the functioning of those cells. And by putting on a foliar leaf-feeding nutrient package of macro and micronutrients, we feed every plant in that field. Not much, but enough to postpone stress, to deal with stress, to grow some roots, to prolong its ability to deal with the environmental conditions it's facing. And we know that across the landscape and throughout this growth cycle, we have a lot of variability. For example, we get temperature regimes that change during this crop cycle. Across the landscape, we get changes in water holding capacity, compaction, pH, organic matter, which influences water holding capacity and the ability for the soil to release nutrients. And we have variability in terms of the microbial activity in the soil, which is also key to the availability of nutrients to the plant. On top of that, we have a change that takes place sort of from pollination back to seeding. And we put in most of our nutrients here at seeding, and we need to because those are macronutrients, a large amount of nutrients required. And that supports the growth here through this vegetative stage of the roots, the shoots, and the reproductive components to a point where we then get pollination. So during this period, the sink for all the photosynthetic activity in the nutrients is going to be the vegetative tissue. And then when we hit pollination, the sink is going to be the seed. So when we hit pollination, we have to have that plant loaded because it's going to shut down the amount of nutrients it's going to divert to the root because the root can't feed itself, and it's going to divert that photosynthetic material and the nutrients into the seed. And that's what we're going to talk about and how it pollinates and we create a crop. We're going to talk about stress because for me, growing a crop is all about photosynthesis and stress management. And when we talk about abiotic stress, it can be anything from drought to salinity, but most of the time it's a drought for a big chunk of the country. So what does the plant do when it's under stress? It produces antioxidants. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that when a plant or any sort of creature is using oxygen for metabolism, it produces free radicals or damaged oxygen molecules, and antioxidants go about scavenging those free radicals we call reactive oxygen species. Things like carotenoids, those bright colors, vitamin E, glutathione is a sulfur compound, ascorbic acid is vitamin C, same thing we in humans use to scavenge free radicals. Then we have these enzymes that scavenge free radicals, catalases, peroxidases, SOD, superoxide dismutase, which can move them into hydrogen peroxide and then turn them into water to get rid of them. Go figure. Then it can also produce these compatible solutes, things like proline, which is an amino acid, glycine betaines, which are nitrogen compounds, polyamines, which are hormones. These solutes actually allow the cell to have the ability to deal with loss of water, low temperatures, and high heat by putting more solutes into the cell. And then all the molecules that make up hormones are produced as well by the machinery of the genetics to a point where we get stabilization of the cell. So the plant is moving things around, it's making hormones, it's changing so that it's got a sort of a balanced system. The same thing holds true for pollen. It's the same group of materials and molecules that are upregulated by the plant to give you pollen viability, because the main objective of the plant is produce seeds. So those carbohydrates, amino acids, polyamines, hormones, and lipids are key to success in pollen production and eventually fertilization of the seed. Now we can take a look at Dr. Marshner put this out quite a while ago, showing that there's a shift in terms of demand for nutrients as we move from vegetative to reproductive stage. And you can see it goes up quite substantially, triples there, doubles there with copper quadruples, and calcium also quadruples, and it's used in pollen tubes and pollen, lignin for making strong pollen tubes, a whole bunch of things. Now, we don't apply calcium because it's a macronutrient largely. That goes in with something like sulfur plus or premium polysulfate, but that's where we put those large dosages in of our macronutrients early on in the growing cycle in order to produce all that vegetative material, and also to load the plant with the major nutrients and micronutrients as well going into reproduction. So here's what we have in flower, and we've shown you that kind of thing. We got a lot of potassium, which we need, and late in the season it's hard for the plant to get. So how does it function? Well, it increases pollen tube growth, pollen hydration, viability of pollen. The potassium is used for dehiscence in order to open up the anther and allow the pollen out. Now, the other thing about potassium is it's really key in stress management as a whole. And these nutrients here that came, according to Marshner's stuff, are key. They're transitional metals. They're key in terms of dealing with the stress issues, to making those SODs, superoxide dismutase, things that can scavenge those free radicals. The boron's involved in making the cell walls, nitrogen in making all the proteins. And if we want to grow a crop, we need to set the seed, we need to make pods, and we need to make a lot of seeds and grow big seeds to get that yield. And for things like canola, that is uses some pollination from insects, it increases bee visitation, because if the plant is healthy, it's got a lot of nectar and pollen, the bees will be attracted to it, and it produces a lot of honey here in Western Canada and Ontario. So, and the bees will go back to the hive and tell them which are the good fields, because they just know how to do that. So we're going to take a look at, pollen production, pollen dehiscence, and pollination, and then of course fertilization. So the first thing that happens is a mature pollen grain has to land on the stigma, which is, and it's be rehydrated, and it pops open a pollen tube, and a pollen tube grows down this transmission tissue down to the ovule. The pollen tube enters the ovule, and it releases the sperm into the cells, and we get fertilization of the egg, and we get a second fertilization which produces the endosperm. Now, in dicotyledonous plants, we don't have an endosperm, and dicots are now called eudicots, but we don't have an endosperm, we have cotyledons. So the endosperm is broken down to become the cotyledons. In wheat, the plant retains the endosperm, and the cotyledons and the endosperm are the nutrient supply for the new germinating seed that grows your next crop. So let's take a close look at how this all goes on. When the pollen grain lands on the tip of the stigma, it's hydrated. There's a little portal here that allows the pollen tube to escape, and then the pollen tube grows down towards the ovule, and on the way down it splits and produces two sperms, because we got that double fertilization, one for the actual embryo, the zygote, and one for the endosperm. On the way down, it picks up nutrients as it moves and can strengthen the pollen tube, and it carries the sperm down towards the tip so that when it gets there, it can open it up and release it. It also has mitochondria. It's a single cell, and the pollen grain itself doesn't add much to the growth of the tube. It has to feed as it moves through that transmission tissue. And here you can see some lines which are the trails of the pollen tubes as it moves through that style down to the ovules. I'll show you that in a second, the exact thing. Now, the direction of the tube is controlled by gradations of calcium and pH changes, and calcium is really key for both building the structure of the cell walls of the pollen tube uh, and, uh, and signaling the direction it should flow. And here we have an expanded view of it, and we can see that the calcium, which is depicted by the red, is very intense at the tip, and then some of it is stored back here in the vacuole, and there's all kinds of activity going on here at the tip where nutrients are coming in and stuff is moving out, and there are even reactive oxygen species here that it's having to deal with, and calcium ions that are moving about. And back here we get strengthening of the pollen tube wall so that it can move forward. And this is not very strong. It's not protected because it's got to feed and basically grow as it moves through that transmission tissue. Now here's what it looks like in reality. There's the primary bud cluster and rosette, and when you can see those buds, everything is already formed there and it's just got to grow it through that vegetative period. And when we look inside of that bud, you can see the anthers are green. So it's going to feed those pollen grains. It's got to be fed as it grows, sort of matures. And here's the actual stigma, which becomes, or the style, which becomes the pod in the end, and the stigma at the tip where pollination takes place. As it elongates, you can see this is the primary bud cluster, and this will be the biggest pod, and these will be the biggest pods here at the base, and then at the tip to maybe get nothing. And then at each of the leaf axials, you can have new bud clusters that are formed that progressively mature as the plant ages. As a parallel, you could say that this would represent the primary, head on a wheat plant, and these would be kind of like tillers, except there's a lot more bud clusters than tillers. Here we got the yellow, the petals forming. These are the petals. That's why you call it yellow bud. And if we look inside of there, you can see that the ovules are here, the anthers are there, but they're not mature. When we see this, where we get buds that are actually lost and aborted, we quite frequently think that's Lagus bug damage, and it in many cases is, because you can get feeding by Lagus bug, puncturing the bud and causing it to be aborted. But there can be just natural abortion that takes place, especially if there are stresses at specific times and shortages of carbon from photosynthesis. The plant will sacrifice a lot of buds. When this happens, though, this is a stress environment that has occurred when you lose a whole series of buds or pods in a row. That usually means you've had a heat stress event somewhere in there that caused that abortion. As the plant continues to mature and the petals open up, you can see the stigma's clean and the anthers are down here. They're not mature, and you'll notice that they're very short. And that's just a side shot of it. There's no pollen on the stigma, and these are quite immature yet. As the plant gets older, you can see that the tips are opening here, and that the anthers are now elongated, or the filament that holds the anthers elongated past the tip of the stigma. And you can see pollen already forming or being moving onto the stigma. It's hygroscopic because the pollen is dried by the plant and then it falls or is attracted to the stigma. And it's in the air as well because, you know, a lot of people are allergic to pollen from canola. So it seems to be mobile in the air and transmitted by thrips and bees and so on. So there it's open, and now you can see the pollen here on the stigma, and this opening is driven by, or dehiscence, is driven by a lot of potassium. You got some degeneration of the cells that allow it to open, and this mature pollen is then free to move on to the stigma. When it gets to the stigma, it's greeted by this array of carbon, sugars, and water that is provided through little portals called aquaporins up there to hydrate the pollen so it will germinate. And you can see this pollen grain here has been moved up above the stigma, and the pollen tubes are running down here to pollinate each seed or fertilize each seed. Uh, Once fertilization has taken place, the petals drop and the style expands to form the pod. And if you look inside of the pod now, this tiny pod, you can see here the seeds, and the seeds are attached to this transmission tissue, which is being fed by the plant. And in fact, it is this spot right here that is weak and takes in moisture into the seed when it's going to germinate, but it's got to be fed. So if you're short of nutrients, you're short of water, you're going to lose some of these. If you're not fertilized, you're going to lose them. So it's really key to have all your nutrients in the plant and ready to move them up here if it's needed, if the roots can't supply those nutrients. Same thing holds for peas. Here's unfertilized, or unpollinated, here's pollinated. Same thing, the pollen leaves the anthers. Same thing holds with wheat. This is just wheat. The tip of the anther opens and the pollen comes bubbling out. It's picked up by the stigma, and you can see the stigma is like a big feathery thing here. And if you look at it, you can see that it's just covered with sugars as well. Same kind of principle holds true for basically the plants that we grow here in Canada that are crops. The pollen has to be hydrated and fed, and the pollen tube grows down to fertilize the ovules. So in summary, we can put on this nutrient package here at this 5 to 30% bloom along with the fungicide, for example, going into early bloom so that we're getting on a small amount of nutrient on all the parts of the plants, on the leaves, on the shoots, on the reproductive parts, and anything that is in excess of what the plant needs immediately for whatever growth or stress management strategies that it will have. And it will have them. You just have to have faith the plant will do its best. We can get this to them and supplement it, and whatever's left over that isn't used immediately will eventually be shuttled into the seed at the end of the day. Remember that canola and peas and so on have a high protein content, so that means a lot of nitrogen is required, amino acids to form that nitrogen. We need a lot of phosphorus in there in order to provide the nuclear material, as well as the nitrogen that's involved in the nuclear material, and we need the potash there to manage things, to move water, to open and close stomata, to push out roots, to allow pollen to be exposed. And then we need all these transitional metals here in order to provide all the enzyme activity that is required as the plant moves into this reproductive stage. I hope that helps. And I think it's worthwhile to consider, even under these dry conditions, to put on a foliar nutrient package going into reproduction, because you never know when it's going to rain. And if you can delay that stress for a few days until it rains, it can really help and increase that yield at the end. I hope this helps. Good luck and take care.